I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth.
On May 5, 1961, Rear Admiral Alan Shepard was launched into space from Cape Canaveral, Florida. His flight, the Mercury Freedom 7, broke numerous barriers in American space exploration and paved the way for the United States to reach the moon. Although the flight lasted only 15 minutes and 28 seconds, it made history. The Freedom 7 flight became the first manned American space mission and propelled the United States forward in the space race against the Soviet Union. President John F. Kennedy's bold announcement in 1961 came right at the height of strained tensions between the United States of America and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Kennedy's declaration came in the hopes that the United States would put a man on the moon before the end of the 1960s, thus winning the space race between the Soviets and the Americans. Many Americans wanted nothing more than to beat the USSR in the space race, as a fierce rivalry between the two nations had been roaring for decades.
The Cold War and the competition between the Soviets and the Americans started very quickly after World War II. The two countries were allied during the war against the Nazis. And then once the war was over, it was really only about 3 or 4 years before both countries had very clearly delineated blocks and were basically unable to deal with each other diplomatically. So the tensions rose very fast after World War II.
Right after World War II, the Cold War began. The two main superpowers in this war were the United States and the Soviet Union. Since both of these nations had access to atomic weapons, American and Soviet officials both understood that fighting directly could lead to a nuclear apocalypse, so the two countries engaged in a Cold War. America and the Soviet Union fought the Cold War like a chess game, with the two countries constantly checking each other to make sure the other never gained any more power. As the Cold War continued, tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States ran high. Many Americans cared about winning the space race because it unified a politically and culturally fractured country. The space race was a way for Americans to put aside their differences and come together to root for the United States. The space race began on October 4th, 1957, with the launching of the Soviet satellite Sputnik 1. Although it wasn't very large, this was a huge victory for the Soviet Union. The USSR soon after launched a second satellite, Sputnik 2, accomplishing another feat, putting the first living being, a dog named Laika, into space. The United States was shocked and scared by Sputnik's launch. Many Americans thought that after World War II, America was far more technologically advanced than the Soviet Union, but the launching of Sputnik 1 and 2 showed them otherwise. In his book, Assault on the Unknown, Walter Sullivan stated, "The feeling of wonder and excitement at man's escape from the Earth was largely lost in fear. They believed that if the Soviet Union could send a satellite to space, then they could launch ballistic missiles carrying nuclear weapons to the United States. Since both nations had access to hydrogen bombs, America was swept by mass panic and fear."
Part of the fear was the idea if they have a rocket strong enough to put a satellite in space, then they can put a nuclear warhead in space, and that can reach the United States.
This later led to the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. This treaty prohibited the testing of nuclear weapons in space, underwater, or in the atmosphere. Even though the Soviet Union had gotten an early start in the space race, America didn't give up. Quickly after the launch of the Soviet satellites, the United States began developing the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. NASA was officially founded on July 29, 1958. T. Keith Glennon, the first administrator of NASA, approved Project Mercury in October 1958. Several U.S. citizens believed that an American space program wasn't necessary and a frivolous expense with no real payoff.
There were some Americans who thought it was wasteful because it was an extraordinary amount of money towards something that in material terms didn't mean anything.
Civil rights movement groups throughout the country protested NASA's founding. "We are not protesting America's achievement in outer space. We are protesting our country's inability to choose humane priorities," said Southern Christian Leadership Conference official Hosea Williams.
When you start getting to the middle of the 60s, about 64, 65, you start getting a little less interest among black communities who are again thinking, why are we spending all that money in space when we should be spending here on Earth?
Project Mercury was designed to put an astronaut into Earth's orbit. Over 100 candidates, both men and women, had to undergo several physical tests to make sure they were in perfect health. Only 7 men were selected. The 7 selected to become astronauts were known as the Mercury 7. NASA conducted multiple test flights on the Mercury space capsules before considering them safe for humans. These tests helped NASA engineers discover and fix any problems with the capsules. The tests included semi-manned flights with 3 primates named Sam, Ham, and Enos. The astronaut approved to pilot the first Mercury flight was Alan Shepard. Alan Shepard served on the destroyer ship Cogswell in World War II. After the war, Shepard flew experimental planes and worked as an instructor for the Naval Test Pilot School. The Mercury Freedom 7 was a conical one-man capsule. It wasn't built for comfort, as it was hardly big enough for Alan Shepard to fit in. The vehicle that launched the capsule into space was the Mercury Redstone 3. In 1961, construction on the Freedom 7 capsule and Redstone vehicle was completed. Moreover, American officials considered postponing the Freedom 7 flight. After the Bay of Pigs invasion failure, they believed the US couldn't handle another mistake. Dr. Edward C. Welsh, Executive Secretary to NASC, remarked, "One of the advisors to the president raised the point that maybe we should postpone the Shepard flight. We've had a number of things go rather poorly here, maybe we just shouldn't do this right now." However, the president decided against delaying the flight. The United States was ready to put the first man in space. However, only 23 days before the first Mercury flight, the Soviet Union launched Soviet cosmonaut Yuri A. Gagarin into orbit. Gagarin became the first man in space on April 12, 1961, narrowly beating out Alan Shepard. About the Soviet space program, Yuri Gagarin said, "Nothing will stop us. The road to the stars is steep and dangerous, but we're not afraid. Space flights can't be stopped." US officials and citizens alike were all disappointed that America didn't get the distinction of putting the first man in space. However, they were still all excited for the upcoming barrier-breaking spaceflight. On May 5, 1961, at 9:34 a.m. EST, America watched as Rear Admiral Alan B. Shepard Jr. was launched into space from Cape Canaveral, Florida. His spacecraft reached an altitude of 116.5 miles and a maximum speed of 5,134 miles per hour. Shepard made observations of the Earth and space during his flight by looking through his periscope. In addition, he made observations and saw if everything was running smoothly. Shepard further had to pilot the Freedom 7 during re-entry.
So I was going through the motions of flying, but at the same time trying to assess physiologically how I felt, and was I dizzy or confused and so on. I looked down through the periscope, which is all we had at that point, and made a few remarks, I think, on the tape.
After only 15 minutes and 28 seconds, the Mercury spacecraft splashed down and was recovered in the Atlantic Ocean, almost 300 miles away from Cape Canaveral. American citizens rejoiced at the successful spaceflight because it proved that the United States was still in the space race. In the coming days after the historic Freedom 7 flight to space, newspaper headlines were filled with the news of the Americans' triumph. The United States knew that they were still behind the space race, but the success renewed the country's excitement in the space program. The Pittsburgh Sentinel reported, "The successful shot puts the United States back into the space race with Russia. Today's suborbital shot does not match the Russian achievement, but is a major step toward orbiting an American." The Freedom 7 flight helped NASA scientists observe what happens to a person's body while in space, and how a person functions in microgravity. The spaceflight also reinvigorated NASA engineers, which led to 5 more Project Mercury missions, 10 Project Gemini missions, and 17 Project Apollo missions. The information that was learned from the first Mercury flight was instrumental for future spaceflights. NASA engineers utilized this information to orbit a man around the Earth, have a man walk in space, to eventually land a man on the moon.
When the Soviet Union had all these successes, I think that was a moment where the United States and its leadership felt like their confidence had been challenged. Even though it was not that impressive, at least they were able to do it, right? And I think that was the beginning of producing some confidence that no, we got this, we can do it.
Today, NASA is a well-known American agency that has changed the way humans explore space. They have innovated new space technology, such as the Mars rover, and contributed to the creation of the International Space Station, furthermore continuing microgravity testing in various elements. The Mercury Freedom 7 flight was a major contribution to America, as winning the space race brought honor and pride to the United States during the formidable Cold War. Without this barrier-breaking achievement, America couldn't have surpassed the Soviets' early advancements in space history. This flight laid the foundation of the American space program, and it allowed NASA to build, create, and foster success in science and space.